She was standing on my porch with my husband's eyes. I didn't know her name. I didn't know she existed. But she knew exactly who I was. My name is Caroline Merritt. I'm 38 years old. And until the afternoon of October 14th, I thought I had a good life. Before I tell you what happened, and I am going to tell you everything, every single detail, because this story deserves to be told completely and honestly, and without me softening any of the edges, I need you to do one thing. I need you to stay with me. Not because this is going to be easy. Not because you're going to feel good by the end of it. But because if you leave before the ending, you are going to miss the part that actually matters. The part that I almost missed myself. So stay. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because I share them every single week. Leave a comment when something hits you. I read every single one. And keep your phone down, because you are going to want your full attention on this. Not a perfect life. Let me be clear about that right from the start, because I think one of the biggest mistakes we make when we tell stories about loss is that we paint the before as this golden, flawless thing, and then the after as rubble. Reality is more complicated than that. Reality always is. My life before October 14th was good, solid, real, built brick by brick over more than a decade, but it was not without its fractures. Its quiet, ordinary imperfections. The kind that exist in every marriage, in every household, in every life that two people are trying to share. But it was mine. And I believed in it. And that, in the end, is the part that mattered. I need to take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where the seeds of all of this were planted, even if neither of us knew it at the time. Even if I spent 11 years walking right over the spot where those seeds were buried, without feeling the ground move beneath my feet. I met Daniel Merritt when I was 22 years old. I had just finished my undergraduate degree in communications at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was interning at a small digital marketing agency in downtown Raleigh. I was still figuring out what I wanted to be, still in that strange suspended state between who you were in college and who you're going to become in the actual world. I had a terrible apartment with a leaking faucet, and a roommate who kept strange hours, and a second-hand couch that sagged on the left side. I had more confidence than I had any right to, and less certainty than I showed anyone. I was 22, and I thought I had everything mostly under control, which is exactly the kind of thing you think when you are 22 and have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Daniel was 25. He had come to the agency as a client. His company used us for their social media management, and we met in a conference room where I was supposed to be taking notes and instead spent half the meeting looking at the way he listened. Not at me specifically, not at first. Just at whoever was talking. He had this quality of focused attention, this quality of actually being present in a conversation that I had not encountered very often in the people I knew at that age. Most people my age, and many people older, had the habit of performing attention while actually thinking about something else. Daniel did not do that. When someone was speaking, he was genuinely listening. I noticed it immediately. I filed it away. After the meeting, he asked me if I knew a good coffee place nearby. Not in a line-delivering way. Just as an honest question from someone new to the neighborhood. I told him about the place 2 blocks over. He said thank you. That was it. He came back the following week for another meeting, and this time when it ended, he said, "That coffee place was excellent, by the way. Good call." And I said, "I have other good recommendations if you run out." And he said, "I was hoping you'd say that." We got coffee that Friday. We talked for 3 hours. I missed my afternoon train home and didn't care at all. I want to tell you something about those early months with Daniel, because I think it's important to understand what I was working with. What made this man so compelling, so easy to trust, so fundamentally believable? Because if you're listening to this story and thinking, how could she not have known, how could she have missed it, you need to understand first who he was. Or who he seemed to be. Because with some people, the performance of a certain self is so complete and so consistent that you cannot separate the performance from the person. You genuinely cannot find the seam. Daniel was not flashy. He did not charm people the way some men do, loudly, theatrically, with big gestures and well-timed jokes that always land. He was quiet. He was steady. He was the kind of person who remembered what you told him 3 conversations ago and brought it up again naturally, not to impress you, but just because he'd been thinking about it. He was the kind of person who noticed when your glass was empty before you did. Who drove home the long way when you'd had a rough day because you'd mentioned once, months earlier, that you liked driving past the river when things felt heavy. He paid attention. That was his gift. And it is, I want to say this clearly, one of the most powerful things a person can offer you. Because attention is what we are all starving for, even when we don't know it. When someone actually, truly pays attention to you, not to what you can give them, not to how you make them look, not to the idea of you, but to you, the real, specific, particular you, it creates a kind of gravity that is very hard to pull yourself out of, even when you should. I fell in love with Daniel Merritt over the course of about 4 months, and then I spent the next 2 years falling deeper, without noticing that I was falling at all. That is what it felt like. Not a decision. Not a leap. Just a slow, complete, total immersion that felt as natural as breathing. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He didn't do it dramatically, no restaurants, no big scenes, no surprise audiences. He did it on a Sunday morning in my terrible apartment with the leaking faucet, while we were both still in pajamas, and I was making terrible coffee, and he was reading the paper. He just looked up and said, "I think we should get married." And I said, "Okay." And then I started crying, which neither of us had expected, and he came and hugged me, and we stood in my kitchen for a long time just holding on. We got married 18 months later. A Saturday in June. My grandmother's backyard in Asheville, 40 people who actually mattered, a slightly crooked cake my best friend Renata baked herself, and a ceremony that lasted exactly 22 minutes because we had both agreed we wanted something real and not something that felt like a production. Daniel wrote his own vows. He talked about attention, how he had spent his life learning to pay attention to the things that mattered, and how meeting me had clarified what those things were. How he wanted to spend the rest of his life paying attention to me, to us, to the life we were going to build. 11 years later, when I found out what he had actually been paying attention to all along, those words would come back to me in a way that felt like a physical injury. Like something pressed directly against a bruise. But I'm not there yet. We have a long way to go first. We moved to Raleigh permanently the year after we married. Daniel was working in logistics, account management for a mid-sized company called Hartwell Solutions, and I had landed a full-time position as a content strategist for a regional healthcare company. We rented for 2 years while we saved, and then when I was 28, we bought the house. A 3-bedroom colonial on a street called Sycamore Lane, though the trees lining it were actually oaks, which always seemed like a failure of naming that I found oddly charming. The house had a front porch and a back garden and a garage that was too small for both cars, so one of us always ended up parking in the driveway. We took turns without discussing it, rotating naturally, which I now recognize as a small example of the way our marriage worked at its best, with an easy, unspoken accommodation that felt less like compromise and more like synchronization. We got Biscuit, our golden retriever, the first spring we were in the house. He was 8 weeks old and the size of a loaf of bread, and he destroyed 3 pairs of my shoes in his first month with us, which I had been warned about and which I still found somehow astonishing. He grew into a 65-pound dog who believed he was a lapdog, who greeted every single person who came through our front door as though they were the specific person he had been waiting for his entire life, and who slept at the foot of our bed with an absolute certainty about his right to be there that I have always found deeply admirable. Our life on Sycamore Lane settled into its rhythms. Morning walks with Biscuit. Weekend farmers market runs. The vegetable garden Daniel started in the side yard that was wildly optimistic in scope and moderately successful in execution. We got a lot of zucchini, some good tomatoes, and 1 year a truly remarkable pepper plant. Friday nights that were usually dinner, and a movie, Saturday mornings that were usually slow and coffee-filled, Sunday afternoons that were usually a mix of errands and quiet. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just the real, specific texture of a life being shared between two people. We tried for a baby when I was 31. I should be honest about this part, even though it is still tender in a way that 11 years has not fully resolved. We tried for about a year. We did the temperature tracking, and the timing and the quiet, private hope that rises and falls in a monthly cycle that becomes its own kind of emotional weather. It did not happen. We saw a specialist. There were options, interventions, procedures, possibilities. We talked about them. We made the decision together not to pursue them. That decision was more complicated than one conversation, more painful than any single moment, and ultimately arrived at the way most real decisions are. Gradually, with a lot of grief folded into it, and without a clean resolution, but with an acceptance that felt, eventually, livable. We did not adopt. We did not do IVF. We were the couple without children, which carries its own particular kind of social weight. The slight pause at dinner parties when the conversation turns to someone's kid's school play, the well-meaning but exhausting questions about when you're going to start, which gradually shifted over the years to the well-meaning but equally exhausting silence on the subject. We were okay. We found our own rhythms and our own shape. We had each other, and we had Biscuit, and we had the vegetable garden and the friends who mattered and the life we had built, and I told myself that was enough. I told myself that enough times, and eventually I meant it. That is not sadness. I want to be clear about that. Or rather, it is sadness, but not the crushing kind. It is the kind of sadness that you make peace with, that becomes part of the texture of your life rather than a wound in it. We were happy. I genuinely believe that. I was happy. I thought Daniel was. That is the thing I cannot fully resolve, even now. I do not know whether Daniel was happy. I do not know whether the life we had together was enough for him, or whether there was always this other piece of himself that he was maintaining in parallel, and whether those two facts, the happiness and the parallel life, could both be true simultaneously. My therapist says they can. She says people are capable of genuine compartmentalization, of loving two things that cannot coexist, of holding contradictions that they have convinced themselves are not contradictions. I understand this intellectually. I am still working on understanding it in my body, in the place where betrayal lives, which is somewhere below the ribs and above the stomach, and is apparently not a place that intellect reaches very efficiently. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Let me stay in the before for a little while longer, because you need to understand the before to understand what came after. Daniel and I had, by most measures, a good marriage. Not a perfect one. I want to keep saying that, because I refuse to perform the kind of retroactive idealization that makes betrayal stories feel like fairy tales gone wrong. We had friction. We had dry spells and miscommunications and disagreements about money and evenings, where we were in the same room, but genuinely not connecting. He had a way of going quiet under stress that I found difficult, that I sometimes experienced as a shutout when it was more probably just his processing mechanism. I had a way of needing to talk things through to their conclusion that he sometimes found exhausting, that he occasionally responded to by becoming artificially agreeable just to close the conversation, which I would eventually notice, and which would frustrate me all over again. We were two specific, particular people trying to share a life, and that is always going to involve friction. What I believed was that we were managing the friction. What I believed was that underneath the friction was a bedrock that held. I was not wrong about the bedrock. I need to say that, even now, even after everything. The bedrock was real. The love was real. I have sat with this truth in the worst moments of this past year, and held it up to the light from every angle I could manage, and I cannot make it into something that wasn't there. The love was real. It was just not the only thing that was real. The first sign that something was wrong, the very first sign, the one that I caught and then carefully looked away from, came in July. Not August, the way I initially told myself, because I have been trying very hard to be honest with myself through all of this, and honesty requires me to admit that the first sign was earlier than I claimed. It was a Sunday morning, and I had woken up before Daniel, which was unusual. He was typically the earlier riser, and I had gone downstairs and made coffee and was standing at the kitchen window watching the back garden and the early summer light and thinking about exactly nothing in particular. Daniel's phone was on the counter, charging. It buzzed. I glanced at it without meaning to. I was not snooping. I was not looking. I happened to be standing near it, and it happened to buzz, and my eyes went to it the way eyes do when something moves, without intention, without agenda. The screen showed a message preview. The sender name was saved as a letter, just the initial V. The preview read, "She has a recital Thursday, thought you'd want to know." That was it. "She has a recital Thursday, thought you'd want to know." I stood there for a moment. I looked at that message. And then I looked away, because I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was clearly something benign, a colleague's kid, a family member's performance, a context I simply didn't have. I told myself that snooping was a violation of trust, and that I was not that person, and that reading too much into a four-word text preview was exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that eroded good marriages from the inside. I told myself all of those things. I put the phone back on the counter, face down. I poured my coffee. I went and sat on the back porch. Daniel came downstairs 40 minutes later. He made himself coffee. He picked up his phone. I watched him read the message from where I was sitting, through the kitchen window. I watched his expression, the slight shift of something across his face that was not quite the expression of a man reading an inconsequential text. He typed a quick reply and put the phone in his pocket. "Morning," he said, coming out onto the porch. "Morning," I said. We sat in the Sunday morning light, and I said nothing, and he said nothing, and Biscuit came out and flopped at my feet, and I reached down and scratched his ears, and I told myself, "It's nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing." I am very good at telling myself things. July passed. Daniel was his usual self, present, attentive, steady. He brought me coffee in the mornings. He remembered to call the plumber about the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for 2 months. He sat next to me on the couch in the evenings, with his hand resting near mine, and sometimes he'd absently pick up my hand while he was reading, without looking at me, just holding it the way you hold something you're used to holding. Those are the moments that are hardest to think about now. Those small, habitual tendernesses that felt like evidence of love, and which I suppose, in some complicated way, they were. August came. The month I originally told myself was when I first began to notice things, because August was when the signs became multiple and harder to dismiss individually, even if I was still working hard at the dismissal. He was on his phone more. That is a cliché of the suspicious spouse narrative, I know. But the specifics of how he was on his phone more were telling, in retrospect. The angle of the screen, the habit of placing it face down when he wasn't actively using it, the way he'd take it into the bathroom or out to the garage. Not dramatic departures. Just small adjustments in behavior that individually meant nothing, but which, accumulated, created a pattern. He was also tired in a way that felt different from his regular tired. Daniel had always been a good sleeper, 8 hours, out completely, rarely restless. In August, he started waking up in the night. I would feel him shift, feel the absence of weight as he slipped out of bed, hear him moving quietly in the hallway or downstairs. He always came back. He was never gone long. But the waking was new, and the quiet nocturnal restlessness was new, and I noticed it the way a body notices a change in air pressure. Not consciously, not analytically, but in some animal part of itself that registers threat before the thinking brain can catch up. I did not ask him about it. I told myself he was stressed about work. I told myself the restructuring at Hartwell was taking a toll. I told myself that my job, as a wife, as a partner, as the person who loved him, was to be a steady presence and not to add to his anxiety by making the things he was carrying heavier. Looking back, I understand that I was also protecting myself. Because the question I would have had to ask if I hadn't explained it away was a question I was not ready to ask. And not being ready is a kind of choice. I know that now. The charges on our joint account started in September. I have already told you about the first one, the $40 pharmacy charge in an unfamiliar part of town, explained away with a client meeting and cold medicine. The second one, the grocery store, I did not mention to him. But there were more after that. A kid's clothing store, $43. A dinner charge at a restaurant I didn't recognize, $87. On a Tuesday evening, when Daniel told me he had stayed late at the office for a video call with a West Coast client. A charge at a bookstore, $22. That shouldn't have been notable, but that stuck with me because Daniel typically bought books on his personal card, not the joint one. I made a spreadsheet. I am a content strategist. I know how to organize information. I made a quiet, private spreadsheet on a personal document that I saved to my work drive where Daniel would not think to look, and I logged the dates and amounts of the charges that didn't fit. I did this over about 2 weeks. I looked at the spreadsheet every few days. And then I would close it and not think about it, or try not to think about it, because what it was starting to look like was something I was not prepared to look at directly. I want to stop here and say something to you, because I think it matters. I think there is a version of this story where the woman who makes the spreadsheet looks like a suspicious, paranoid, distrustful wife who was looking for trouble she created herself. And I have spent time, not as much as I probably should have, but some, considering that version. I have asked myself whether I was manufacturing a problem, whether the charges were innocent, and I was pattern matching for betrayal because some unacknowledged fear had primed me to find it. Here is my honest answer, maybe. Maybe there was a period early in that process where the evidence was genuinely ambiguous, and my interpretation of it was colored by anxiety. But by the time the spreadsheet had 2 weeks of entries, the charges were too specific, and too consistent, and too systematically located in a part of town I had no legitimate reason to be in for me to keep making innocent explanations. The evidence was there. I had built myself a very neat, very detailed picture of it. And I still did not look directly at it for 2 more weeks. Because looking directly at it meant knowing. And knowing meant the end of the life I had. And I was not ready for the end of the life I had. I keep saying that. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. Because I think that is actually the most honest thing I can tell you about the weeks before Daniel's heart attack. Not that I was blind, not that I was deceived so thoroughly I had no clue, but that I was not ready to see what I could already feel. That is a human thing. That is not a weak thing. That is just what it is to be a person standing at the edge of an information that will change everything, unable to make yourself step over. I stepped over. Eventually. But not by choice. Fate did it for me, in the worst possible way. It was a Wednesday morning in the last week of September, and Daniel was on a client call at his desk in the home office. We both worked from home 3 days a week, and on those days, the house had a particular quiet rhythm of keyboard sounds and muted voices and coffee cups accumulating, and I was in the kitchen making a second round of coffee when I heard it. I need to describe this carefully because I want you to understand why it stopped me completely. It was not a scream. It was not a dramatic collapse sound, not the kind of thing you see in movies where someone dramatically cries out and crashes to the floor. It was something much quieter and somehow much more frightening than that. It was a low, confused, involuntary sound, the kind of sound a person makes when their body does something their mind didn't authorize, when the physical self encounters something it cannot process, and then a single heavy silence, and then the crash of a chair hitting the hardwood floor. I was moving before I had a thought. I was in the doorway of his office in what felt like an instant, and Daniel was on the floor, on his left side, conscious but only just, one hand pressed flat against his chest. His face was the color of old wax. His eyes were open and he was looking at me, but there was something wrong with the look, something frightened and distant and not quite present, and he said my name, just Caro, one word, and the effort of that one word was visible on his face. I called 911. I crouched on the floor next to him and I kept his hand and I talked to him. I don't remember what I said, something about staying with me, about the ambulance coming, about looking at me. And I told the dispatcher everything they needed, and I unlocked the front door so the paramedics could get in. And I did all of those things with a clarity that I later understood was shock, the adrenaline competence that kicks in when emotion cannot afford to happen yet. The paramedics were there in 6 minutes. They worked fast and efficiently, and spoke in the shorthand of people who have done this many times. And I stood out of the way, and answered their questions when they asked me, and watched them load my husband onto a stretcher with the particular feeling of someone who is observing something that cannot be real. In the ambulance, a paramedic told me his vitals were stabilizing. That was the word, stabilizing. I held onto it, the way you hold onto a railing when the ground isn't steady. The cardiologist met me in the emergency department, waiting room 40 minutes after we arrived. He was a calm, direct man in his 50s, who explained the situation without condescension and without unnecessary softening. Daniel had experienced a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, caused by a significant blockage in his left anterior descending artery. The blockage was serious, but had been caught before causing catastrophic damage. He would need surgery, a stent procedure, and then a careful recovery. His prognosis was good, but the recovery would take weeks, and the lifestyle adjustments would be permanent. Is he going to be okay? I asked. We're optimistic, the cardiologist said. Yes. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. I called his mother, Patricia, in Charlotte first. She cried and said she would drive up first thing in the morning. I called his brother Marcus in Atlanta, who was quieter, more contained, said he'd be there by Thursday. I called my own mother, who also cried and asked if I needed her, and I said not yet, which was both true and not true simultaneously, the way so many things were in those weeks. I texted Renata, my best friend, who responded within 30 seconds with I'm getting in my car, and I replied please don't. I'll call you when I know more. And she replied okay, but I have my keys in my hand just so you know. I sat in a plastic chair with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime during the Clinton administration, and I looked at a television in the corner showing a news channel on mute, and I did not cry. I wanted to cry. I could feel it somewhere in my chest, this enormous pressurized thing that wanted to come out. But it wouldn't move. It just sat there inside me, heavy and motionless, while I watched the muted television and waited. He came out of surgery at 9:30 that evening. He was in a hospital room by 10. When I walked in, he was connected to various monitors and looked smaller than he had ever looked in the 11 years I had known him. Small in the way that hospital beds make everyone look small, like the scale of the room recalibrates your understanding of the person in it. He opened his eyes when I came in. They were unfocused for a moment, gauzy with anesthetic, and then they found me, and he looked at me for a long moment. I'm sorry, Caro, he said. I thought he meant sorry for the scare. Sorry for the surgery, for the hospital, for the terrifying thing his body had done on a Wednesday morning while I was making coffee. I sat down next to his bed and took his hand, which was cool and slightly foremarked, and I said, You have nothing to be sorry about. He looked at me for a moment that felt long. Then he closed his eyes. Yes, I do, he said very quietly. And I thought he was just expressing the general helplessness of a person who has ended up in a hospital bed, that particular guilt patients often feel about inconveniencing the people who love them. I squeezed his hand. Sleep, I said. We'll talk later. He slept. I drove home at midnight. I sat in the driveway for a while without getting out of the car. Then I went inside and fed Biscuit and lay down on our bed without changing clothes and stared at the ceiling until the light outside started to go gray, and then I got up and went back to the hospital. I am not going to walk you through all 9 days. He was hospitalized in real time, because this story is long enough already, and I have more important things to get to. But I want to give you the texture of those 9 days, because they matter. Because in those 9 days, 2 things were happening simultaneously. I was being the dedicated, loving wife, present and steady, and there every hour that I could manage. And I was also quietly on fire. The thing about finding out your husband might die, might actually, physically, suddenly not be there anymore, is that it rearranges your priorities in ways that can be disorienting in their clarity. I had spent weeks carefully, not looking at what was in front of me. In the first days after his heart attack, I did not have the bandwidth for that careful not looking. The fear was too large. It crowded out everything else. But fear eventually subsides to a livable level, even when the thing you're afraid of is still present. And as the initial terror of the first day or two settled into the grim but manageable anxiety of recovery, the things I had been not looking at started to reassert themselves. They are patient, those things. They wait. It was on the 6th day of his hospitalization that I found the folder. I had gone home mid-afternoon to get his phone charger. The hospital room had one outlet near the head of the bed, and he had been using mine since the first day, and I needed it back for a work call that I could not postpone any longer. It was a 20-minute round trip on a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in and out quickly, except that I was not quite out quickly, because on my way through the house I stopped in his home office. I stopped because I needed to grab a cable from his desk drawer. That was the actual, innocent reason. I needed a specific cable that I knew he kept in the shallow right-hand drawer of his desk, and I opened the drawer and found it, and I was about to leave when I noticed that the filing cabinet, the one that sat in the corner of his office, the one that was always locked, always, without exception, with a key that lived on his personal keyring, was slightly, barely, almost imperceptibly ajar. Not open. Not hanging open. Just ajar. 1/4 of an inch. The latch not quite caught. I stood there for a moment and looked at it. Here is what I told myself in that moment. I told myself it was probably nothing. That he had been in the cabinet recently for some legitimate reason and had not shut it properly. That it was not an invitation and that opening it would be a violation of his privacy, and that I had always respected that cabinet because Daniel had always said it was just tax stuff and boring financial documents, and I had believed him and had no reason not to. Here is what I also told myself, in the other part of my mind that I had been working very hard to silence for 3 months. I told myself that my husband was lying in a hospital bed, and that I did not know what his medical decisions should look like, and that if there was something in that cabinet that was relevant to our life, to our finances, to our marriage, then I needed to know it. That second argument won. I opened the cabinet. The contents were largely as he had described: tax files, old car titles, mortgage documents, insurance paperwork, warranty cards for appliances I had forgotten we owned, his college transcripts, which gave me a brief unexpected surge of tenderness before I pushed it aside. Everything filed neatly. Everything labeled in his precise, slightly architectural handwriting. Alphabetically organized. He was, in all things domestic, an organizer. The folder was at the very back, behind a tab labeled Miscellaneous, which was something of a tip-off because Daniel did not do miscellaneous. Daniel did categories. Daniel did specific, precise labeling. Miscellaneous was not his style. It was a plain manila folder. No label at all. Tucked behind the miscellaneous tab, and then behind a second hanging file that I had to move to reach it. I took it out. I put it on his desk. I opened it. And I sat down. What was inside was a paper record of a bank account. A solo account, in Daniel's name only, at a bank we did not use together, opened in 2013. 11 years ago. The year we were married. The statements went back years. Not all of them, they tapered off, becoming more sporadic, because I assumed the account was primarily managed online and the paper statements had been stopped at some point. But there were enough. There was enough. The account had received regular deposits, consistent with what I knew of his salary, indicating that he had been routing a portion of his income here for years. And from it there was a monthly transfer, every single month without exception, ranging from $800 to $1,200, to another account. That account was registered to a name I did not know. Elena Voss. I looked at that name for a long time. I looked at the 11 years of transfers. I looked at the balance of the account, which was just over $23,000. I looked at the address listed on the oldest statement, which was in Durham, North Carolina. 40 minutes away. I put everything back. I put the folder back where I had found it. I closed the cabinet. I went to the bathroom and sat on the floor with my back against the tub and let the room be very still around me and breathed for a while. Then I got up. I got Daniel's charger. I drove back to the hospital. I sat next to his bed and held his hand and watched him sleep and did not say a single word about what I had found. Because I did not know enough yet. And I was not going to say anything until I did. I gave myself 3 days. He was in the hospital for 3 more days after I found the folder, and I spent a portion of each of those days. In the evenings, at home, after hours at his bedside, researching. I want to be honest about how I felt during those 3 days, because I think it is easy to imagine a version of this where the discovery clarifies everything, where the fear burns off and is replaced by the clean, cold force of someone who has decided they are done being fooled. That is not what it felt like. What it felt like was more complicated and less cinematic than that. It felt like being asked to solve a puzzle while standing on unstable ground, while also being terrified for the person who had created the puzzle, while also being furious at that person, while also loving that person, while also barely keeping yourself together enough to function. The fear for him was real. I want to say that clearly. Whatever he had done, whatever was waiting for me at the end of this investigation, I was still standing in a hospital room watching my husband recover from a heart attack, and the fear that he might not fully recover was also real and also present, coexisting with everything else. Human beings are capable of holding multiple enormous feelings at once. This is not a contradiction. It is just the truth of what it is to be a person in an impossible situation. Elena Voss was not hard to find. A person with moderate internet research skills and a few hours can find almost anyone, and I have above-average internet research skills. Within 30 minutes of sitting down with my laptop on the first evening, I had built a basic profile. Elena Voss, 34 years old. A graphic designer, working freelance based on her professional website, which was clean and tasteful and showed a portfolio of branding work for small businesses. She lived in Durham, in a neighborhood I vaguely knew, a mix of older bungalows and newer infill development, not far from downtown. Her social media presence was limited, but not absent. A Facebook profile fairly private. An Instagram that was public, mostly images of design work, and occasional personal moments. She was pretty in the specific, unaffected way of someone who has never thought much about being pretty. Dark hair, easy smile, comfortable in photos the way some people are and others aren't. And she had a daughter. Her name was Maya. Maya Voss, who would be turning 17 in December. A teenager with dark hair in a low ponytail, who appeared in her mother's Instagram occasionally, at a farmer's market, at a school art show, at the beach somewhere last summer, squinting into the sun with that particular teenage expression of reluctant participation. A normal girl. A girl who looked, from the angle of these curated glimpses, like she was doing well. Like she had people who loved her, and a life that was full. I was looking at Maya Voss's face on my laptop screen when I understood, truly understood, that this was not what I had been half expecting, which was an affair, a recent one, a lapse of some kind, a woman in another city that he had been seeing and sending money to keep quiet. That was the story I had been preparing myself for, the story I had some cultural script for, some framework of how to process. This was not that story. Maya Voss was 16 years old, almost 17. She had Daniel's particular shade of brown eyes, a very specific warm brown with a slight gold undertone that I had looked into thousands of times over 11 years, and that I would know anywhere. She had Daniel's way of tilting her head slightly in photographs, the same left-leaning angle he used when he was thinking, or when he found something amusing. She had his eyebrows. She was his daughter. He had been a father since before we were married. Elena Voss had been pregnant with Maya Voss when Daniel and I were first dating. Or close to it. I did the math twice, in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub, because I did not trust myself to do it correctly while my hands were shaking that way. Close to it. Their relationship, whatever it had been, had produced a child in the period when Daniel and I were becoming something serious. And he had known. He had known from the beginning. He had known when he proposed. He had known when he wrote those vows about paying attention. He had known every single day of our 11-year marriage. And he had paid for it, literally from a secret account, every single month. I sat with this information for 24 hours, before I felt anything that I could identify as a single, clean emotion. In the first hours after I confirmed it, really confirmed it, not just suspected, what I felt was something I can only describe as a kind of atmospheric pressure change. As though the air in whatever room I was in had become slightly heavier, slightly different, and my body was recalibrating to it without my permission. Not crying. Not screaming. Just recalibrate. Then the grief came. It came around 2 in the morning, the second night, while I was lying in our bed listening to the oak trees moving outside the window. It came quietly and completely, and it was grief for the specific thing it is most devastating to lose. Not a person, not a relationship, but a story. The story of your own life that you believed to be true. The story in which you knew what you had, in which the ground beneath you was solid, in which the person lying next to you was, in the ways that fundamentally mattered, the person you had understood them to be. I was grieving the story. I was grieving the life I had lived inside the story. And that grief, I discovered, is enormous. It is not smaller than the grief of losing a person. In some ways it is larger because the person is still there, the person is still alive and recovering in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, and the story is nonetheless completely, irreversibly gone. After the grief, about 18 hours in, came the anger. And here is what I want to tell you about the anger. It was not the hot, explosive, dishes-smashing kind. It was cold. Controlled. Architectural. It arrived like a new piece of furniture in a room, something that took up space, that had weight and presence, that you would now have to accommodate. I was furious with Daniel, in a way that I could feel in my jaw, in the muscles of my hands, in the back of my skull. I was furious with the specific, particular quality of his betrayal, not just the act of it, but the duration. 11 years. The deliberateness of the separate account, the care with which it had been kept. The way he had looked at me every single morning of our marriage with those attentive, paying attention eyes, and had held this entire other world behind them. The anger was also, I understood even then, not a simple thing. It was layered. There was the fury at the betrayal. There was also, underneath it, a quieter and more complicated anger at myself, for the missed signals, for the spreadsheet I had made and then mostly avoided looking at, for the text preview I had read in July and then filed away. I am not in the habit of self-blame as a reflex, but there is a version of this anger that belongs to me, and I have tried to be honest with myself about that. Not because I deserve to be deceived. I did not, no one does. But because honesty requires acknowledging the ways I participated in my own not knowing. On the day Daniel came home from the hospital, I had known for 5 days. I had not said anything. I had gone to the hospital every day, sat at his bedside, talked to his doctors, coordinated with his mother who had driven up and stayed 3 days before I sent her home with reassurances. I had done all of this knowing what I knew. And I had not said anything, because there was still something in me, still, even then, that understood he was fragile and recovering, and that the conversation we needed to have was one that required him to be able to hold his own weight. I helped him out of the car when we got home. I helped him up the porch steps, slowly, his hand on my arm. I settled him on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and his phone charger and the television remote, and I made him tea and brought it to him and sat across from him while he drank it. And he looked at me with these exhausted, grateful, post-hospital eyes, the eyes of a man who has been frightened and is now home and is relieved, the eyes of a man who believes, still, that home is safe, and he said, "I don't deserve you, Caroline." And I said very quietly, "No, you really don't." He thought it was a joke. He gave me a small, tired smile. He closed his eyes. I sat across from him for a long time after he fell asleep. I looked at his face. I looked at the face of the man I had loved for almost 14 years, the man I had married and built a life with and shared a bed with, and tried to have a child with and grieved with and laughed with, and argued with and forgiven small things with and loved, quietly and persistently, and without drama, through 11 years of ordinary, extraordinary life. I looked at his face, and I felt everything I have already told you, the grief, the fury, the recalibration, and underneath all of it, underneath every complicated layer, something that I cannot name except to say that it felt like sorrow. Not anger. Not hatred. Just a deep oceanic sadness for everything that had been real, and was now, irreversibly, also something else. 3 weeks later, the doorbell rang. October 14th was a Tuesday. Daniel was still recovering, 3 weeks out from the surgery, still sleeping more than he was awake, still moving carefully, still on the simplified diet and the twice-daily medications and the doctor-mandated restricted activity. He had been upstairs most of the afternoon. I had been at the kitchen table with my laptop, doing the thing I had been doing since he came home, sitting in the same physical space as my regular life while being internally somewhere else entirely. I had not confronted him. I had not said anything. I had made a private decision, or arrived at it gradually, the way private decisions tend to form, more as an accumulation than a single moment, that I was going to know everything before I said a word. Not most of it. Not enough of it. Everything. Because I had spent 3 months knowing part of things and carefully not knowing the rest, and I was not going to do that again. When I said what I had to say, I was going to say it from a position of complete information. He was not going to be able to offer me some piece that I hadn't accounted for, some context that reframed the picture I had. I was going to have the complete picture. Then I was going to speak. So I sat at the kitchen table and I worked, or tried to, and Biscuit was at my feet, and the afternoon was that particular amber gold of October in North Carolina, the specific color of late-day autumn sunlight that I have loved since I was a child, and that I have never been able to look at in the 3 years since without also feeling this day. The doorbell rang at 4:18 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the clock on my laptop as I stood up, the way you do absently, the way the time gets stamped into the moment without you deciding to record it. 4:18. Biscuit lifted his head but didn't bark, which meant whoever was at the door wasn't a stranger to him, or rather, wasn't a stranger to a degree that triggered his alarm. He simply raised his head, watched me go, then put it back down. I walked to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel beside it, I could see the shape of someone on the porch, not a delivery driver. The shape was wrong for that, too still, too deliberate, and I opened the door. She was tall for her age, which I didn't know yet, and she was holding the strap of her backpack with both hands, the way teenagers hold things when they are trying to look calm and their hands need something to do. She had dark hair in a low ponytail, slightly loose, a few strands out at the temple, the ponytail of someone who had done it that morning and had a full day since. She was wearing a dark blue hoodie and jeans, and low-top canvas shoes that had seen better days. She was pretty with the unself-conscious prettiness of a teenager who has not yet started thinking about being pretty. And she had Daniel's eyes. The specific warm brown with the gold undertone. The slight heaviness of the brow above them. The particular way they set in the face, close enough together to give the impression of intensity, of focus. His eyes in her face. His eyes looking at me from a face I had never seen before. I did not immediately understand what my body understood before my mind did. My body went very still. My breathing changed. Some animal part of me completed an equation that my conscious mind was still working toward. She looked at me with an expression that I now, having thought about it many times, understand as a kind of carefully controlled apprehension. Not fear exactly. Not hostility. Something that said, I have prepared for this as well as I could, and now that it's happening I'm not sure the preparation was sufficient. Are you Caroline? She asked. Her voice was steady. Not quite steady, there was a very slight catch in it, the kind you only notice if you're listening carefully, but mostly steady. I gave her credit for it, even then. Yes, I said. I'm Maya. She paused. Took a breath. My mom is Elena Voss. Another pause. I think your husband is my dad. The words landed the way words sometimes do, not with the impact of new information, which they weren't, but with the impact of reality. All the research I had done, all the statements I had read, and the Instagram photos I had studied, and the math I had done sitting on the bathroom floor. None of it had made it real in the way that standing here, looking at her, made it real. Because you can know something completely and still not have it be real, until it is standing on your porch in a dark blue hoodie with your husband's eyes, holding a backpack strap and trying very hard to be brave. I looked at her for a long moment. I know, I said. She blinked. She had clearly prepared for several possible responses. Anger, denial, confusion, the door slamming, and none of those preparations had accounted for this one. I know. The two smallest, most complete words in the English language. Come inside, I said. We should talk. And here is where I want to pause, because I think this moment, this single decision, this particular choice at a particular doorway on a Tuesday afternoon in October, is the one that I have turned over more than any other in the months since. I could have closed the door. I want to be clear about that. I had every right to close the door. She was not my responsibility in any legal or logical sense. She was the evidence of my husband's secret, arrived on my doorstep without warning or invitation, and there was no obligation on my part, moral, legal, social, or otherwise, to invite her in and make her tea and sit across from her at my kitchen table. I did not close the door. I think about why, and I come to this. She was 16 years old. She had come here, she told me later, on her own. Her mother didn't know she was there. She had taken 2 buses from Durham. She had knocked on a stranger's door. She had said her own name and her mother's name, and the thing she needed to say with her voice only barely shaking. She had done all of that at 16 years old, because something in her had decided that with her father in a hospital and the world feeling uncertain, she could not wait anymore for someone to explain to her how she fit into the landscape of his life. She was not responsible for any of this. She had been born into a situation she didn't choose, had been raised with a partial truth about her own existence, had spent her childhood knowing she had a father and not fully knowing where he belonged in her life. And she had handled that, from what I could see in those first moments, with more self-possession than most adults would have managed. I could not close the door on that. So I didn't. I made tea. She sat at my kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug, the way I had noticed young people do when they're cold or anxious or both, and I sat across from her, and we talked. Not about everything. Not the whole story, not the full accounting that Daniel and I had yet to have. But the things that a 16-year-old girl needed to be able to say to the woman who was her father's wife. She told me about herself, tentatively at first, and then with increasing ease, the way teenagers talk when they realize the adult across from them is actually listening. She was in 11th grade. She was good at art. She mentioned this carefully, as if not sure whether it was the right thing to lead with, and then more confidently when I asked a follow-up question. She liked graphic novels. She had a dog, a rescue mutt named Chester who was, she informed me seriously, basically a gremlin. She was thinking about studying design, like her mother, but she was also interested in architecture. She wasn't sure yet. She was 16. She had time. She told me about what she knew of Daniel, her dad, she called him, which hit me in a particular way that I managed not to show, which was not the story of a secret or an absence but something more complicated. He had been in her life, she said. Not in the way a father in a single household is present, not the daily ordinary presence of a dad at the breakfast table or dropping her off at school. But present. He came for birthdays. He came for the things she invited him to, the school art show last year, a few of her soccer games when she was younger, a play she had a small part in 8th grade. He called, irregularly but consistently enough that the calls were not surprises. He sent money through her mom every month, and she knew this, and had always known it, and had understood it as part of the particular architecture of her particular family. She was not naive about what this meant. She was 16, not 6. She knew he was married. She had known for years that there was a wife, a house, a life that she was the outside edge of, and she told me this with a directness that I found striking and that I now recognize as the direct consequence of having had a very honest mother. She had her feelings about that. She had been angry, she said. For a long time. She had been angry at being the secret, at being the situation that existed in the margins of someone else's real life. She had done some work on that anger, she said, which was a very 17 years of age way of describing what I understood to be some combination of growing up, and probably some therapy, and the particular resilience, that comes from having at least one parent who is consistently, genuinely there. She was not angry anymore, she said. Or not angry in the way she had been. She just wanted, and here she stopped, and I watched her gather herself, and this was the moment I came closest to crying, watching this girl gather herself. She just wanted him to know that she was okay. That she had turned out okay. That whatever had happened, however messy the circumstances of her existence, she was okay. When I found out he was in the hospital, she said, I kept thinking, what if he died and the last thing I told him was nothing? What if he died and I never told him I wasn't angry anymore? She looked at me across the table. I'm sorry to come here like this, she said. I know this isn't fair to you. I know none of this is fair to you. No, I said. It isn't. I'm sorry. You didn't do anything that requires your apology, I said. You understand that, right? None of this is something you caused. She looked at me for a moment with those eyes. My mom says that, she said. A lot. Your mom is right. She almost smiled. Just barely. The corner of her mouth quickly controlled. I excused myself. I went upstairs. Daniel was awake, propped against the pillows in that careful, convalescent posture he had adopted since coming home, the deliberate stillness of someone whose body has recently reminded them it is not invincible. He was looking at his phone. He looked up when I came in, and something in my face, or maybe just the particular quality of my presence in that doorway, the fact that I had come upstairs at 4:30 on a Tuesday without a specific reason, told him that this was not a normal moment. He went still. Not moving still. No other kind. The kind where a person has understood something, and their whole system pauses around the understanding. There is someone downstairs who needs to speak with you, I said. His face moved through about 6 expressions in rapid succession, the way faces do in moments of shock. Confusion first, then recalibration, then something I can only call recognition, then fear, then grief, then the stillness that comes after all of those things have moved through. Caro, he started. Her name is Maya, I said. She came here on her own. She's 16 years old. She is sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and she is scared, and she is braver than most people I know. I paused. She wants to tell you that she turned out okay. He was crying. Not dramatically. There was no performance in it. It was not for my benefit. It was just the specific, quiet crying of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and cannot anymore. Just tears moving down his face, while he sat in the bed and looked at me. I am so sorry, he said. There is nothing, Caroline, I don't have words. I know, I said. I know, and we are going to have that conversation. We are going to have all of those conversations, every single one of them, and they are not going to be easy, and I am not going to pretend this is fine. But right now, Daniel, right now, none of that is what's happening. Right now. Your daughter is downstairs, and she came here on 2 buses from Durham to tell you that she's not angry at you anymore, and you are going to go down there and you are going to talk to her. He looked at me. Okay, he said. He came downstairs in his robe, moving carefully, one hand on the banister. He came into the kitchen, and Maya looked up from her tea, and they looked at each other for a moment that I cannot fully describe, and that I will not try to, because some moments belong to the people in them and should not be translated by the people watching. What I can tell you is that there was a recognition in it, something elemental, something that did not require history or context or explanation. A parent and a child recognizing each other, even through all the complicated circumstances that had made the recognizing complicated. She stood up. He crossed the room. She let him hug her, briefly, with the particular stiffness of a teenager who is allowing physical comfort from a person she has complicated feelings about, who is simultaneously trying to maintain her composure and allowing herself to be held. He held on carefully, gently, with the carefulness of a man who was recovering from surgery, and also, I think, with the carefulness of someone who understood that this was borrowed time, that she was allowing this, that it was a grace and not a right. I went out the back door. I sat on the porch in the October cold with Biscuit at my feet, and I looked at the oak trees. Those perpetual, impossible, leaf-shedding oak trees on a street named for a different kind of tree entirely. And I let the cold and the light and the sound of the neighborhood settle around me, and I let whatever was moving through me move through me, because there was no other option, and also, strangely, because I found that I needed to. Not crying, not yet, just letting. Being in it. Being exactly where I was. Maya stayed for an hour and 4 minutes. I know because I noted the time when she rang the doorbell, and I noted the time when I heard her say goodbye to Daniel in the hallway. She came to find me on the porch before she left. She stood in the back doorway for a moment, and then she came out and stood near the table. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me in." "I thought about not," I told her. "I know," she said. I could tell. "But you came 2 buses," I said. Something moved across her face. "Yeah," she said. I did. I looked at her. At those eyes in that young, careful face. "You're a good kid," I said. "I can see that clearly." "You don't really know me," she said. "I can see it clearly anyway," I said. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Is it okay if I don't know, is it weird if I contact you sometime? Not like I don't expect anything, I just." "It's not weird," I said. "Give me your number before you go." She gave me her number. She pulled out her phone and texted me a simple hello so I'd have it, and I felt the buzz in my pocket, and looked at the text from a number I didn't know, and the word hello, and I thought about the strangeness of the moment, the specific unprecedented strangeness of sitting on my back porch in October exchanging contact information with my husband's secret daughter. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too," she said. She paused. "I'm really sorry for all of it." "Maya," I said. "This is not your fault. None of it is your fault. Say that to yourself on the bus ride home." She nodded. She went back through the house. I heard the front door open and close. Daniel came out to the porch a few minutes later. He was moving slowly, carefully, and he came and sat in the other chair, the one that used to be his naturally, the one he always sat in when we were out here together. He sat, and we were both quiet, and the cold October evening settled around us. We sat outside for almost an hour. Mostly in silence. At one point, Biscuit got up and went inside, and we let him go, and we just sat there in the cooling air with the leaves moving overhead, and the particular weight of everything there was between us. Eventually, Daniel said, "How long have you known?" "Since the filing cabinet," I said. 11 days. A long silence. "I have to ask you something," I said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, whatever that takes." "Okay. Were you ever going to tell me?" He was quiet for a long time. The oak trees moved. A car went past on the street. Somewhere down the block someone was calling a dog in from the yard. "I don't know," he said finally. "That is not the answer I needed," I said. "I know, I'm sorry." "Were you going to tell me?" I said again, very quietly. "Or were you going to carry this to your grave and let me spend the rest of my life married to a story that was never completely true?" He looked at his hands. "I think," he said slowly, "I had convinced myself that I was protecting you, that what you didn't know couldn't hurt you, that I had made a mistake, a series of mistakes, that I was managing quietly, and that bringing it into our life would only destroy things. So I kept it out." He paused. "That sounds like a justification." "It is a justification," I said. "I know." "You weren't protecting me," I said. "You were protecting yourself." He didn't argue. We sat for a while longer. Then I went inside and made dinner, because whatever else was true, it was dinner time, and we still had bodies that needed to eat. And sometimes the most human thing you can do in a devastating situation is just keep performing the ordinary acts of living while you figure out what comes next. The conversations that followed were not one conversation. They were many. They happened in fragments, over weeks, in the spaces between his recovery appointments and my work calls, and the ordinary business of a life that was in the process of being dismantled from the inside while still maintaining its external form. What he told me, across all of those fragments, was this. He had met Alina at a logistics industry conference in Charlotte in 2012, the year before we got married. They had had, He described it carefully, choosing his words in the way of someone who knows there are no good words for this: an affair. Brief by some standards. Intense. He had been clear with her that he was with someone, that his relationship was serious. She had known. She had also, he said, not known how serious it was, or perhaps had not fully processed it. He did not know. He could not speak for her. When Alina found out she was pregnant, she told him immediately. He remembered the phone call. He described what it had felt like to hear it in terms that, "I will give him this," did not attempt to minimize or aestheticize. He said it had felt like falling, like the floor dropping away. He had been terrified. He had thought about telling me. He had not told me. He had, and here he slowed down, picked his words very carefully, he had offered to be involved. Not to leave me, not to append everything, but to be involved with the child and to provide for it. He and Alina had reached an understanding, a private one, that kept things as contained as possible. She would raise Maya as a single mother, with his financial support, and his presence in Maya's life at whatever level Alina was comfortable with and Maya needed. They would not be together. They would not tell anyone. They would make it work. And they had. That was the thing that was hardest to sit with. They had made it work. 11 years. Not a single slip, not a single moment where the seam had shown, not a single thing that I could point to and say, "There, that was when it almost came out." He had been a father for 11 years, and I had had no idea. He had paid for it, structured it, maintained it, incorporated it into the accounting of his life so seamlessly that it had never produced a visible leak. Until the heart attack. Until the filing cabinet that was left slightly ajar. "Did you ever love her?" I asked him. Not Alina. He knew I meant Maya. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Yes." "She knows that," I said. I could tell. He looked at me. "How are you?" he started, and then stopped. "Don't ask me how I'm doing," I said. "Don't." He didn't. "I want to tell you something that is uncomfortable to admit, because I think honest stories require admitting the uncomfortable parts." In those weeks of conversations, I did not stop loving Daniel. I want to be clear about that, not because it reflects well on me, or because it is the emotionally sophisticated thing to admit, but simply because it was true and pretending otherwise would be a lie. You do not stop loving a person because they have betrayed you. Love is not a logical system. Love does not come with a clause that says it will remove itself when certain conditions are violated. It sits there, immovable and largely indifferent to your preference, while you deal with everything else. I was furious with Daniel. I was grieving. I was rearranged, reoriented, turned inside out by what I had learned. And I also, underneath all of it, loved him. Both things were true at the same time. They were not in conflict with each other. They were both simply real. What I had to figure out was whether love was enough. It was not a fast process. It was not a clean one. It required me to ask myself very hard questions about what I wanted my life to look like, about what I was capable of, about what I owed to myself versus what I owed to the years we had shared and the history we had built. I talked to Renata, who was furious on my behalf in the uncomplicated, loving way that only your best friend can be furious, and who also eventually said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here. Whatever you decide is right." I talked to a therapist. I found her through my company's EAP program, and her name is Dr. Alicia Hartman, and she has very good eyebrows and a very calm, even voice that does not perform empathy but simply has it. She helped me understand some things about myself, about why I had been so skilled at not looking, about what I was most afraid of losing, about the difference between the love you have for someone and the trust that allows that love to function. Love and trust are not the same thing. I knew this abstractly. I had to learn it in my body. Daniel started therapy too. Not with her, with someone else, someone who specialized in this particular kind of rupture. He went twice a week at first, then once. I don't know everything they talked about. I know some of it, the pieces he shared, and I believed them to be honest because by that point the alternative, that he was still performing a version of himself rather than actually working toward accountability, was a possibility I had to reckon with and ultimately concluded was not what was happening. He was doing the work. I could see it. It didn't fix what had broken. But it mattered. Elena Voss called me in late November. She had gotten my number from Maya, who had asked if it was okay and to whom I had said yes, because I had thought this call would probably come, and I had decided I was not going to avoid it. Elena called on a Thursday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my perpetual location, my spot in the middle of the life I was reassembling, and when the unknown number called and I answered it and she said, "Caroline," in a voice that was careful and not quite steady, I took a breath and said, "Yes. Hello, Elena." The conversation lasted 12 minutes. I kept my voice level throughout. She apologized. She said it in several different ways, and the apology was clearly genuine, and I received it without deflecting it or amplifying it. Then I said what I had been thinking about for a while. "I don't think you're the villain of my story. I think Daniel handed you a situation where you were allowed to believe that what you were doing was contained and private. He made choices. He constructed the story. He maintained it. That was his lie to build, not yours." I paused. "I won't tell you I don't have feelings about you. I do. I am working on them. But I want to be honest with you. I don't think it serves either of us to put you in a position where you're carrying guilt for choices that were not primarily yours to make." Silence on the other end. "That is," she started. Stopped. "Thank you, that is more than I expected." "I'm not ready to be your friend," I said. "I might never be. I want to be honest about that too." "I understand," she said. "I hope you and your daughter are well," I said. "I mean that." "We are," she said. A brief pause. "She has talked about you, what you did that day, she says," and here Elena's voice did something brief and tight that suggested the presence of tears. "She says you were kind, that you were kinder than you had to be." I thought about that 16-year-old girl on 2 buses from Durham, holding her backpack strap, trying so hard to be brave. "She did a hard thing," I said. "The least I could do was meet it with something real." Then I said goodbye and hung up. I filed for divorce in March. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no single moment of resolution, no clean break, no final devastating conversation that produced a clear ending. It was just the gradual understanding that what we had was not repairable. Not because the love wasn't there. I have already told you the love was there, complicated and persistent and real. But love without trust is an architecture without a foundation. You can admire it, you can feel it, you can mourn it. You cannot live in it. Daniel did not fight the divorce. He was sad about it, genuinely sad in a way I believed, and he took responsibility in the legal process in ways that were fair and careful, and that cost him more than they had to. I think that was his way of doing what he could. Of saying, without saying it, "I know what I did, and I will not compound it by making this harder than it already is." I kept the house. The oak trees. The garden. Biscuit. In March, when the paperwork was filed and the legal machinery began to turn, I sat on the back porch on an unusually warm afternoon and thought about what my life looked like now and who I was inside it. 38 years old. 12 years of that career I had been building, 3 of them in the current role. A house on a street with the wrong trees. A dog who thought he was a lapdog. A best friend who had driven down the week after everything happened and stayed for 4 days, and made me eat real food, and watch terrible television, and cry in the way that crying needs a witness to be complete. A teenage girl in Durham who had texted me 4 times since October. The first time was a photo of a painting she had made in art class. A coastal scene, green water, soft gray sky, genuinely accomplished for someone her age. I had written back, "This is really good." She replied, "Thanks, I worked on it for like 3 weeks." I replied, "It shows." The second time was a random Tuesday in December. "Hey, can I ask you something weird?" I replied, "Sure." She wrote, "Did you hate me when I showed up at your door?" I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote, "No. I was scared of what you represented. But I didn't hate you." Never you. She took a while to reply. When she did, she wrote, "Okay. Thank you for saying that." The third time was a screenshot of an acceptance letter from an art program she had applied to for the summer. A pre-college studio program at a state university. I wrote back 3 exclamation points, which is more exclamation points than I typically use, and she wrote back a single thumbs up emoji, which I found for some reason entirely characteristic of her. The fourth time was just, "Merry Christmas, Caroline." I wrote back, "Merry Christmas, Maya," and left it there. I don't know what those texts are. I don't know what they become. I am not in the business of predicting futures anymore. I have learned, at some cost, what predictions are worth. But I know that she reached out, and I responded, and there is something in that exchange that I am not going to close the door on. Not yet. I am writing this, telling you this, from a Tuesday evening in April. Biscuit is asleep at my feet. The oak trees in the front yard are starting to bud. That specific tentative green that means spring is happening whether or not you are ready for it, which is, I have come to understand, how most important things happen. I want to tell you what I think I have learned, because I said at the beginning that you needed to stay for the ending, and this is the ending, and it would be dishonest to spend all this time building to it, and then not tell you what it actually is. The ending is not triumphant. I want to be clear about that. It is not the story of a woman who overcame betrayal and found her stronger self, and now lives on the other side of it in some new, luminous version of her life. That is not what this is. This is messier and more real than that. What I know now is this. I know that I was not weak for not seeing it. I have had to work hard at knowing this, have had to say it to myself many times in Dr. Hartman's office with the patient eyebrows and the steady voice, have had to let it be said to me by people I trust before I could begin to say it to myself. I was not weak. I was a person who loved someone and who trusted the architecture of that love, and the architecture was built on a concealment so careful and so maintained that it produced no reliable external evidence for years. That is not blindness. That is the ordinary cost of trusting people. I know that loving someone and knowing them are not the same thing. This is perhaps the most unsettling thing I have learned, the one that sits most uneasily with me still, because if it is true, and I believe it is, then it means that the fundamental act of loving another person involves a kind of faith that cannot be fully supported by evidence. You cannot know someone completely. You can know them very well, deeply, across long years, and still not have access to all of it. This is frightening. It is also, I have come to think, just true. The alternative, the demand for complete knowability, the refusal to extend trust beyond what can be verified, is not love. It is something colder and smaller and ultimately lonelier. So we love and we trust and we hold the possibility of being wrong, and sometimes we are wrong, and then we have to figure out who we are after that. I know that Maya Voss did not choose the circumstances of her existence, and that she has handled those circumstances with a grace and a courage that I genuinely admire. I know that whatever complicated feelings I will always have about everything that her existence represents, those feelings have nothing to do with her, and that conflating them would be a failure of moral clarity that I am not willing to make. She is her own person. She is a 16, almost 17-year-old girl who likes graphic novels and has a gremlin dog named Chester and paints coastal scenes for 3 weeks at a time, and took 2 buses to knock on a stranger's door because she needed to say something real before it was too late. I know that the choice I made that afternoon, to open the door, to invite her in, to make her tea, was the right one. Not the easy one. Not the one that served my own interests most directly. But the right one, in the way that some choices are right not because they benefit you, but because they are simply what a decent person does when another person needs decency. I am not congratulating myself. I am just naming it as what it was. And I know this last one is the hardest, the one I am still working on, the one that Dr. Hartman tells me will take the time it takes. I know that I will be okay. Not because I am particularly resilient, though perhaps I am more than I thought. Not because the loss isn't real, because it is, and it is enormous. But because I have been 38 years old in the specific, particular, unprecedented circumstances of my own life, and I have not been destroyed by them. I have been rearranged. That is different. The oak trees are budding. The divorce is moving through its process. Maya is presumably working on her next painting in a studio somewhere in Durham. Biscuit is asleep at my feet. The world is doing what it does. Moving forward, indifferent to whether you are ready, making space for the things that come next whether or not you have finished processing the things that came before. I rake my own leaves now. I do it methodically, row by row, the way Daniel always did, the way I used to watch him do from the porch with my coffee. I put on a podcast, and I work through the afternoon, and when I'm done I stand in the yard and look at what I've made. It is, every time, a small and completely manageable satisfaction. That is not nothing. In fact, some days it is everything. If you made it this far, thank you. I mean that. Thank you for staying with Caroline's story from that first moment on the porch, all the way through to the April evening, and the oak trees budding, and the leaves that still need raking. Stories like this one don't have clean endings, and I think that's exactly why they matter. Because life doesn't have clean endings either. It just has the next thing, and the person you decide to be when the next thing arrives. If this story hit you somewhere real, if it made you think, made you feel, made you want to call someone or have a conversation you've been putting off, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. This community is built on stories like this one, on the people who stay and engage and share, and every comment you leave tells me what to bring you next. If you're new here, subscribe. Genuinely. New stories every week, family drama, real emotion, the kind of storytelling that stays with you. Hit the bell so you don't miss them. And share this one. Because someone in your life needs to hear it. Someone you know is standing at a door right now, deciding whether to open it. Maybe this helps them make the right call. I'll be back next week with another story. Until then, stay with the hard things. They're usually where the important stuff lives.